I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. We hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun, we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. One summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with the family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night and walk home. The day came. We started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map. So I gave her, "What the hell?" and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and then moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick, forested area. Trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill, and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything on the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer, just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building, whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews, and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we'd picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better. but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on in the early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and talked, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the hell is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this story thoroughly scared the hell out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies. But again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears, and then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the hell out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the lights from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. So, I had a football coach back in high school who was also one of my teachers for a semester. He told us one story that freaked us all out pretty bad. He had a coaching job at a small college in Montana when he was a lot younger and newly married. He said that after practice one evening, he was making his long commute home, and the route ran alongside just fields and fields of hay, grain, whatever. Since it was late summer, it wasn't even approaching dark yet. His car was an old beat-up truck with just a bench seat. Anyway, he's driving along when he sees a hitchhiker on the shoulder. This being back in the day and in small town Montana, my teacher pulled over to let the guy in without a second thought. The man was described as wearing a really old, outdated style of suit. Not quite a zoot suit, but styled in a similar, baggy way. He also had a big, stylish hat. My teacher thought it was weird that he was so overdressed, it being super hot out, but maybe that was the only clothing he had. So, the guy gets in next to my teacher without a word. Teacher asks him where he needs to go, and the guy just points forward. Teacher drives on. Later, my teacher tried talking to the guy, just trying to make simple conversation, but the guy wouldn't speak or even acknowledge him. He just pulled his hat down like he was sleeping. Out of nowhere, the guy just tips up his hat, looks out the window and says, "Stop the car, now." My teacher pulls over and lets him out, not wanting to offend a possibly crazy man. The guy stands on the side of the road for a second, and then, at a dead sprint, just runs off into the field beside the road until my teacher couldn't see him anymore. He waits there for a while, thinking maybe the guy had the runs or something and didn't want to go to the toilet next to the road. After a long enough wait, my teacher gets back in the truck and starts to accelerate back onto the road. The thing about really old trucks is, they don't accelerate very fast. As my teacher got back onto the road, he looked in his rearview mirror to check for a safe merge. But there wasn't a car in sight. What there was the hitchhiker, on all fours like an animal, running or crawling after the truck at an inhuman speed. Meanwhile, my teacher begins to fishtail as he attempts to go faster. The whole time, his eyes glued on the mirror, watching the man chase after his car. Eventually, he was able to get up to speed and lost sight of the guy in his mirror. When he was able to stop at a gas station to use a payphone, he called his wife at home to tell her the story and to lock up the house. She thinks he's just messing with her, and he had been talking to her co-worker about the hitchhiker. When he asks why she would think that, apparently at her office in the town she worked in, one of her co-workers told her a story of the exact same thing happening to them, and it's a well-known urban legend in that town. She thought it was just folks playing with the new girl at work who had to drive home alone at night. My teacher assured her that he was not lying, and she evidently believes him and can vouch for her side of the story, because she showed up to one of our fundraisers and I asked her about it. Now, I just avoid lonely roads in Montana. My mum told me this story about the village where she grew up in Scotland. The village's earliest known settlement is from 3000 BC, so it's old. It's been home to the Picts and the Romans. Nowadays, there is a small woodland, and the rest of the surrounding land is farmland. The woods used to be much larger. They are what survives of a large forest that almost completely surrounded the village. Legend says the forest was home to witches. When the forest was being cleared for expanding farmland, a lone witch came out of the forest to tell the villagers to stop. She said the trees would not forgive man for their destruction, and if the villagers did not heed her words, then all of their land would become infertile, and all of the women. Frightened, the villagers agreed, but asked for a small part of the forest. A deal was made that this, and only this land, could be cleared. The witch also said that for every harvest of every crop grown there, 1 sack of produce must be taken to the edge of the forest and left. This practice was followed for hundreds of years, until the villagers abruptly tore down much of the remaining forest to grow wheat and build a mill. Again, a strange woman came from the forest into the village and threatened the villagers. She said they had broken the promise and would suffer. This time the villagers took the woman and hanged her. Her last words were that the price was now 3 sacks. The man who built the mill was scared, and after the first harvest, he took 3 sacks into the woods. Unlike his neighbours, his crops did not fail, and his wife became pregnant. Always he paid the woods their due, and before long he was the richest man in the village and had 3 beautiful, healthy daughters. Unfortunately, the man grew greedy and thought he'd no longer pay his 3 sacks. The next morning, his youngest daughter went missing. The whole village came to help look for her, but the man asked that his men run the mill as normal, so he didn't lose any money. There was soon a commotion at the mill. Some of the workers had fainted, others were crying, some were shouting. The man came to see what was happening. A horrified worker told him they had started up the mill as normal, but blood had poured from between the stones. They had found his missing daughter. Distraught, the man sold his land and fled the village with his family. The mill was torn down, and years later, a silo was built there. By the 1960s, the silo was ancient and crumbling. It was also rumoured to be haunted either by the farmer, his daughter, or the witch, sometimes all three. This next part is my mum's story. One day, she and her friends had a bet to see who could spend a night in the silo. One boy, who was always boasting of his bravery, volunteered. Between them, my mum and her friends conspired to keep this a secret from their parents by lying about camping in each other's gardens. That evening, the boy, John, climbed the silo loft, and Mum and her friend gave him a bag of food, a blanket and a torch. They told him they'd be back in the morning, but were actually planning on coming back later to frighten him. They had waited a few hours and snuck back to the silo, and alarmingly, they could hear John sobbing and crying for help. They found him quite away from the silo, pulling himself along on his stomach. John had jumped out of the silo loft and broken his ankles. He was carried back to his parents' house and taken to the hospital. After the inevitable week of punishment, my mum was allowed to visit John. She said he still looked as terrified then as he had that night. She asked him what happened. He said he told his parents and the doctors that he fell, but the truth was he saw something. Not long after he was left on his own, he could hear something shuffling around in the loft. He used the torch to see, but there was only empty grain bags. He tried to ignore the noise, but finally it sounded like it was moving towards him. When he shone the torch on the grain bags again, he saw that they were crawling, dragging themselves along the floor towards him. That's why he jumped. The silo's long been demolished, but they've built homes there now. So, about my third year in Japan, I moved to a small town. I'm living way up in the woods, north of the little town I work in. It's a narrow, winding road with a river on one side and a steep mountain on the other. The road is so narrow that there are places to pull over and wait if another car is coming. One night, I'm heading home after work, keeping in mind that if I see a car heading towards me, I or they have to pull over. I'm heading north with the river on my left and mountain on my right. I get to this place that the road curves to the left with a big rock on the left side of the road, right at the curve. I see car lights of a white Taurus type car to the left of the rock, kind of over the river, coming from the other side, and so I pull over to wait for them to pass. I keep waiting for them to come around the rock, which has a small shrine in it, but they never come. Weird, but there are a few buildings up there. Maybe they pulled in just as the rock obscured my vision of them. I head home without thinking much about it. Later that night, I get the munchies, and the only store was back south in the main part of town, so I am driving south this time and come to that same corner, and I see the same white car past the rock shrine coming north towards me. This time, I'm by the buildings and I pull over and wait for him to pass, but again, no car comes. This is really strange, because on the north side, there are places a car could disappear, but on the south side, there is nowhere to go, only a steep mountain on one side and a river on the other. As I ease around the bend, nothing, no car to be seen. So this sticks with me until one day in October, I'm teaching a culture lesson about Halloween in the local junior high school. The subject of ghosts comes up, and I jokingly say, "Hey, I think I saw a ghost. Do you know the road that goes north with the shrine in the corner of?" The whole class begins to scream, like total panic. Girls are crying, guys are shouting, and the Japanese teacher has gone deadly white. Some are literally in the fetal position, moaning, "Stop, stop," over and over. I was floored at the reaction. It seems that the rock was a dangerous place, but was unable to be removed because of the shrine, without offending the gods there. A white car crashed into it, and someone died. People freaked because there was no way I could have possibly known about it. We live in a pretty rural area. and there was a nightclub a lot of young people were visiting on the weekends. Because of the next big city being so far away, many of those visitors had to drive a while to get there. One night, a young woman didn't feel so well and decided to drive home a bit earlier than her friends. She gets into her car and is on her way home. Not far away from the club, she notices something standing on the road she's driving on. Because there are often deer and other wild animals crossing the roads, she slows down a bit and approaches the supposed animal with caution. To her surprise, it's not a deer, but a baby stroller standing there in the middle of the road. She comes to a stop and, against better judgment, decides to investigate. Certainly, someone just dumped it here. As she gets closer to the stroller, she notices the headlights of a car in the distance behind her, which gives her a weird sense of safety because she doesn't feel that alone in this moment. The stroller is empty after all, so she pushes it to the side of the road and gets back into her car. Since she saw the lights of the car just a moment ago, she decides to let it pass before hitting the road again. The vehicle approaches and, to her surprise, doesn't pass her but comes to a stop right behind her. Both doors open almost immediately after coming to a halt, so instead of waiting, she floors the gas and drives off. After a short while, she notices the same car behind her, so she decides to take a detour in the next village, making a turn here and there just to shake them off. Slowly, panic begins to set in. The car is still behind her after some time, and it's now driving dangerously close and flashing its lights. This goes on for a while, and because she doesn't know what to do, she takes out her phone and calls her dad. After explaining the situation as well as she could, he advises her to just head home as fast as possible, and he would leave the front door open for her while calling the police in the meantime. She gets home, slams the door of her car open, and rushes into the house where her parents are already waiting for her. They close the door and wait for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, the doorbell rings, and instead of police, 2 worried young men are standing there, asking if the girl they followed is alright. As it turns out, they were heading home as well after clubbing, and saw somebody entering her car while she was pushing the stroller to the side of the road. They followed her, so the guy in the back seat couldn't do anything. After she stopped in front of the house, the guy jumped out as well, and they were trying to chase him down, but he got away. Nobody knows what would have happened if the 2 guys weren't there at that moment. The road where this allegedly took place is in a pretty remote area with lots of wood around it. I think I never read about it in the papers, which is strange considering the police were supposedly involved. I still get creeped out every time I'm driving down the same road. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night, we were really bored, and he suggested we go explore the house next door, since it had sat empty for a while. We go around back, and there's a dog door that he can crawl through, and he unlocks the door and lets me in. The house itself is really unremarkable. It looked like it was built in maybe the 1950s, and was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against the picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could see the street lights through the window. My friend and I sit down on the floor across from this table and are just hanging out, talking. All of a sudden, my friend screams, and in that instant, my vision goes black. But it wasn't that I just couldn't see. My body was engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I start screaming, and I feel my friend's hand grabbing mine and pulling me in some direction forcefully. My vision slowly comes back, and I start to warm up, when I realise that we're outside under the street light. It was December, and should have been much warmer inside of that house. Finally, I look at my friend, and he looks scared. I'm really confused and kind of panicked myself, and finally ask him what happened. He says that as I was talking, a black thing, this figure that was all black and only had the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from under the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open, like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out, he pulled me out of the house. We're still friends, and we bring it up every now and again, but the story itself never changes, and still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple of days afterwards, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. I lived in a bizarre little house as a child. It was incredibly tall and thin, like an attached house except freestanding, with 3 floors, a basement and an attic. It was full of quirks, such as 2 fully functional fireplaces, a shower stall in the centre of the basement, a backyard so small that you could not take 5 paces without hitting the fence, and an old-timey rope-pull dumbwaiter that led from the kitchen to my bedroom. I loved that weird little place, but unfortunately it was incredibly old, and half of its charm was the fact that it seems to have been designed by an inarticulate conclave of lunatics, and eventually the repair costs exceeded what my parents were willing to sink into it, and we had to move. Preparing for the move was a chore. I packed most of my stuff myself, and I had taken to throwing stuff down the dumbwaiter and shoving all my clothes so thickly in my closet that they became a single solid brick of fabric. While clearing that closet out, in fact, I came across a feature I hadn't noticed before, an attic entrance in the roof. Being an adventurous kid, I opened her up, stood on the clothes brick, and began my first and last exploration into the topmost part of our weird little house. The first thing I noticed was that it wasn't as dark as it should have been. The place was strung with old red Christmas lights, which still burned with leftover incandescence, and a dozen little cracks and holes peeped down into all the bedrooms below. The second thing I noticed was that the place was set up for habitation. The insulation was plasticked away. There was an old gurney piled with sleeping bags and sheets, and a rusted mint green refrigerator which still worked when I tested it. The third thing was the bones. There were a lot of bones. I was a kid at the time, with a limited understanding of anatomy, but there were bones of all types, heaped into a series of piles around the centre of the attic, small and large, clean and white, from every and any imaginable sort of creature, haphazardly stacked in a half-dozen osseous clumps. 2 of them were blackened, as if someone had tried to burn them, and the walls nearest those blackened piles were scrawled in dark bone char messages. Mostly they were just smears, but the word sorry appeared more than once. That room had been sitting over my head for 8 years while I slept. My mum's whole side of the family was raised Catholic. All went to the same church in a small town in the south. I was there one summer as a kid. I'm maybe like 10 years old. My uncle's farmland backs right up to the church. Things haven't been going so well on the farm. Crops not growing right. Healthy animals randomly dropping dead. Chickens and small creatures showing up gutted, even though he had a donkey to protect the cattle. Just weird stuff that's never happened before. So, one day, the adults are acting super weird and cagey, how they act when something big is going down, but they don't want to scare the kids. My grandma, mum, uncle, aunt, some older cousins, and the priest and another man from the church are all hanging out on my uncle's farm, and they basically kick me out of the house to go play. Naturally, being a very curious kid, I climb as high as I can in the nearest tree to the house, trying to eavesdrop. I hear a snippet of conversation here and there, but can't figure out what they're up to. Everyone leaves the house, following the priest to the barn, stables, chicken coop, etc. This entire time, I'm watching from the tree. While they're all down at the stables, I hear the door to the house open, and a woman I've never seen before, maybe 30 years old, with brown hair and a blue dress, casually walks out the door. She briefly looks up at me in the tree. I wave. She ignores me and walks off down the dirt road. Once the adults are done with whatever they're doing, we all gather in the dining room of my uncle's house to have some lemonade my aunt made. I decide to pipe up and ask them who the woman in the blue dress was. Every adult in the room freaks out. My aunt starts crying. The priest looks like he might throw up, and I'm told the woman was just visiting. A decade later is when my uncle finally tells me that the woman I saw was an apparition that had started appearing to parishioners at the church and next door on my uncle's land. They assumed she was a lost spirit trying to pass on, but after she attacked the priest at his house and farm animals started showing up dead, they decided she was some sort of demon who appeared as a young woman to hide her true nature. The day I saw her from the tree, the adults had gotten permission from the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism on my uncle's land. It appears I witnessed her leaving. I wonder where she was going. I'm 26 years old today, and the story of Evelyn, as the parishioners started calling her, still gives me goosebumps. She was completely expressionless when she looked up at me in that tree. Didn't seem in any hurry to leave either. The moment she was gone, the crops started recovering, and we stopped finding dead and eviscerated livestock. I'm not religious, and I'm generally a pretty big skeptic, but I'll never be able to explain what I saw from the oak tree that day. This will get buried, but I have never gone camping or out into the woods at night after this trip. A few friends and I had a long weekend, 5 days off from school, and we decided to go camping in the North GA mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent. There were 5 of us, 2 guys, 3 girls, and loaded up my buddy's truck. He and I had some experience being outdoors or hiking, and he's an army vet, so we packed really well and had all sorts of amenities like a propane stove, fold-up cots, portable shower. We were in it for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 or 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a big pond or tiny lake in it. We stepped into the open area and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around. Even the clouds and wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I both thought, well, there's got to be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns just in case. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured it was a mountain lion or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking around the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing just at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed she must live somewhere nearby, and so we continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder to where she was standing, but she was gone. The sounds of the forest returned once we got into the trees. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that as it was getting late and we didn't want to be stuck building camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked and set up and built a fire, popped a couple of beers and sat down to hang out. There was a girl I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked what was wrong, and she said, "Nothing, it just got really quiet." We both quickly dressed and headed back outside to the fire. The others hadn't noticed anything strange and didn't mention anything wrong, except joking with us that it took a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on but not ignited and had gone empty overnight. None of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt she left on a little folding chair or stool. We figured we just misplaced things, or someone had used them and put them somewhere else. During the second full day, we were looking for a waterfall that we read online was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up the top of a hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman. Same clothes and all, just standing. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us or not, but she was just standing there. My buddy told the girls he thought he saw a mountain lion following us and was going to go and scare it off. He hustled up the hill, making a lot of noise, and came back about 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls, but told me aside that the woman wasn't there when he got up there. We hiked back to the camp and found it a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear something had gotten into our stuff. We told the girls it was probably raccoons. We both took our guns to bed with us. That night, things went sideways. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm. I opened my eyes and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent and my buddy was sitting up halfway, looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2-ish hours until the sun started coming up, and then packed our stuff and we all headed out. The entire hike back into town was eerily silent. There were a couple of points I thought I saw the woman through the trees, but never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely and got back to the truck in what seemed like half the time it took to get out to the camp. After we were safely on the road back home, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone else about moments they thought they heard or saw the woman all weekend, but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The wild part was, none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it was blurry. No idea who she was, but I've never been camping or hiking at night since.